The desert did not announce the beginning of a new era with thunder. It began in darkness, with columns of Iraqi armor moving south across the Kuwaiti border on August 2nd, 1990, their engines carrying a war that most of the world had not yet imagined. Kuwait was small, rich, and exposed, lying between Iraq and the Persian Gulf like a doorway to oil fields, ports, and power. Within hours, that doorway was being forced open by tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, commandos, helicopters, and artillery. For armored warfare, this was not just another invasion. It was the moment when the tank, so often discussed in Cold War exercises and staff papers, returned to the center of history as a weapon of decision, coercion, and shock. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. Iraq had come to this morning bruised but dangerous. The war with Iran had ended only 2 years earlier, after 8 years of trench lines, artillery barrages, chemical weapons, mass casualties, and grinding offensives that had consumed a generation. Saddam Hussein's army was one of the largest in the region, with thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, many of them Soviet-designed, and with commanders used to operating on a scale that dwarfed Kuwait's defenses. But it was also an army marked by the habits of that earlier war. It understood weight, endurance, and punishment better than speed, improvisation, and flexible command. On August 2nd, that did not matter yet, because against Kuwait, the first requirement was not elegance. It was force delivered suddenly, before a smaller state could steady itself. The political causes had been gathering like heat before a storm. Iraq was deep in debt after the war with Iran and believed Kuwait should forgive loans and support higher oil prices. Saddam accused Kuwait of overproducing oil and of taking crude from a disputed field along the border. These disputes might sound dry from a distance, the language of ministries and economic figures, but in the Gulf, they touched money, sovereignty, pride, and survival. Saddam chose to settle them with armor. That decision turned grievances into tracks on roads and diplomatic tension into a mechanized advance. The invasion showed a brutal truth that had not changed since the earliest tank battles. When politics crosses into armored movement, events can outrun speeches, negotiations, and even the ability of governments to understand what has already happened. Kuwait's defenders were not cowards, and the collapse of Kuwait was not a simple story of men unwilling to fight. The problem was scale. Kuwait's armed forces had some modern equipment and trained personnel, but they were too small, too scattered, and too surprised to hold back a much larger invading army. Iraqi units struck toward Kuwait City, key installations and command centers, while airborne and special operations forces added confusion behind and around the main armored thrusts. Some Kuwaiti troops resisted where they could, and others withdrew south toward Saudi Arabia to preserve what remained of the force. Yet the larger picture was grimly clear. Iraq had brought an armored army to a fight against a state without the depth, numbers, or time to absorb the blow. To picture the invasion without a map, imagine the border as a low northern threshold and Kuwait City as the prize lying to the southeast, close enough that a fast mechanized force could reach it before the world had fully reacted. The ground did not slow the Iraqi columns the way forests, mountains, or rivers might have done. Much of the approach was open, road-connected, and suitable for vehicles that could move quickly when fuel and traffic control held together. Desert terrain can be unforgiving to machines because sand, heat, dust, and distance punish engines and crews. But Kuwait was not yet the deep maneuver battlefield that would later challenge the coalition. For Iraq, the first stage was a short, violent lunge, and the lunge worked. That success carried its own danger. A tank army that has just conquered a neighbor does not become less threatening when it stops. It becomes a question mark on tracks. Once Iraqi forces occupied Kuwait, the world had to ask whether they would halt there or continue south into Saudi Arabia, where oil fields, ports, and air bases formed the strategic heart of the Gulf. The fear was not imaginary. Armored formations exist to exploit opportunity, and if Saddam believed the moment was favorable, there were few natural barriers that guaranteed Saudi Arabia would be safe. This is why August 2nd mattered beyond Kuwait itself. It created the possibility of a wider armored crisis,
one in which a regional war could alter the balance of energy, alliances, and military power.
In Washington, Riyadh, London, Cairo, and other capitals, the invasion forced decisions at a pace no planning document could make comfortable. The first problem was not how to liberate Kuwait, it was how to keep the disaster from expanding. The United States and its partners began moving forces to defend Saudi Arabia in what became Operation Desert Shield, but the early arrivals could not instantly match Iraq's heavy armor. Aircraft could arrive faster than divisions, light troops could move faster than armored brigades. Heavy tanks, recovery vehicles, ammunition stocks, spare parts, fuel systems, field hospitals, and the machinery of a modern army had to cross oceans and then assemble in a desert theater. The world saw a crisis. Logisticians saw tonnage, ports, schedules, and the terrible cost of being late.
That is one reason the road to 73 Easting begins here, months before any American cavalry troops saw Iraqi tanks through thermal sights. Battles are often remembered by their dramatic final collision, but armored warfare is built long before the first shot. It is built in loading docks, railheads, maintenance bays, command posts, training areas, and fuel depots. Iraq's invasion created the need for a coalition army powerful enough not merely to block Saddam, but eventually to throw him out of Kuwait and break the armored forces defending his conquest. The famous clash at 73 Easting would later feel sudden, almost violent in its speed, but its roots were planted in this first shock. The grid line in the desert was waiting at the end of a chain that began on August 2nd.
The Iraqi army that settled into Kuwait looked formidable from the outside. It had regular divisions, Republican Guard formations, artillery, air defenses, tanks, armored personnel carriers, engineers, supply units, and a recent history of surviving a long war. The Republican Guard in particular carried political weight because it was better equipped, more trusted by Saddam, and treated as a shield for the regime as much as a battlefield force. Yet occupation changed the character of the Iraqi problem. The invader now had to defend a stolen country against a coalition forming beyond the horizon. Tanks that had seemed so decisive during the attack became part of a defensive system that depended on fixed positions, supply routes, command networks, and the ability to withstand air attack. An armored army can seize ground quickly, but holding ground against a patient and powerful enemy is another matter. The contrast between the Iraqi and American ways of war was not yet obvious in August, but it was already taking shape. Iraq had used armor in the old language of intimidation and mass: cross the border, overrun the defender, occupy the capital, present the world with a completed fact. The United States Army, by contrast, would eventually bring a doctrine shaped by the late Cold War, one that emphasized combined arms, air-ground coordination, deep attack, and rapid maneuver against enemy formations. None of that was automatic. Doctrine is only an idea until soldiers can execute it under fear, confusion, weather, and fatigue. Still, the invasion gave the American military the very kind of test it had spent years preparing for in Europe: a large mechanized enemy, a theater that demanded speed, and a decision that would depend on more than bravery. For the crews who would later fight in the Gulf, the invasion was also the beginning of transformation. Soldiers who had trained in Germany against the imagined threat of Soviet armor now had to prepare for a real desert war against Iraq. Their habits had to change. Navigation would no longer mean moving from village to tree line to road junction. It would mean holding direction across open spaces where landmarks disappeared into haze and dust. Maintenance crews had to think about sand in filters, heat on engines, and the strain of long movements. Commanders had to imagine distances larger than many European training areas could contain. The machinery mattered, especially the M1A1 Abrams, the Bradley fighting vehicle, and thermal sights. But machines alone were not enough. Crews had to learn how to make technology useful when the desert tried to erase the battlefield. There is a temptation to tell this story as though the Iraqi invasion simply awakened an unbeatable coalition machine. That would make the outcome seem inevitable, and it was not how the crisis felt at the beginning. In August 1990, Iraq had already won the first round. Kuwait was occupied. Saddam had hostages, oil infrastructure, and a large army sitting in a position that threatened the Gulf. Coalition unity had to be built, not assumed.
Saudi Arabia had to accept foreign forces on its soil. The United Nations, regional powers, and Western governments had to align policy, military planning, and public patience. Armored warfare may be fought by tanks, but it is made possible by political decisions. Before any gunner fired in the desert, leaders had to decide that the invasion would not stand.
That decision set two clocks running at once. One belonged to Iraq, which had time to dig in, spread forces through Kuwait, prepare obstacles, and hope the coalition would lose nerve or fracture. The other belonged to the coalition, which needed time to build combat power, while knowing that every week also allowed Iraq to settle deeper into its conquest. This tension gave Desert Shield its quiet drama. It was not a battle in the cinematic sense, but it was a race all the same. A race between deployment and escalation, between deterrence and Iraqi confidence, between the arrival of heavy armor and the fear that it might be needed before enough of it was ready. The tanks that mattered most in those first weeks were not yet charging. They were being loaded, shipped, received, fueled, repaired, and organized. The significance of August 2nd, 1990, is that it opened the last great armored campaign of the 20th century and reminded the world that mechanized war had not become a museum piece. Iraq proved that tanks could still change borders overnight. The coalition would later prove that modern armored warfare had evolved into something much larger than tank against tank, a system of reconnaissance, air power, artillery, logistics, communications, training, and command initiative moving at a pace that could shatter a less flexible enemy. 73 Easting would become the season's centerpiece, but it was not born in the dust storm of February 26, 1991. It began here, in the dark movement across a border, when an armored invasion of a small country forced a global answer and set heavy armies on the long road toward collision.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.